Hello, and welcome to Deconstructing History, the podcast where we talk about all things living history and reenacting. I am your host, Mike Baker. On today's episode, I'm excited to have on the podcast one of my mentors, Dr. Erika Briesacher. Dr. Briesacher is an associate professor of history at Worcester State University, where she also teaches courses on public history. Dr. Briesacher received her PhD in history from Kent State University, where her main focus is on 20th century Germany. And we're very glad to have her on the podcast today. So now on with the show. So what is meant by public history, and how did you personally get interested in doing public history as an academic field?
So public history is actually a really umbrella term in that it encompasses things like historical sites, it can encompass things, monuments or museums or archives, research libraries, pretty much any place where history or cultural activities, right, are being done for the purposes of for consumption by them. And so that's why, there's really sort of this question sometimes about, well, isn't education a type of public? And the argument kind of is no, but yes, because it's really thinking about who the end user is. And you don't really have that in the context of, say, your conventional classroom. You do with outcomes and what students should be taking away from things, but it isn't really about the general public. And so I really got into public history. I mean, obviously, as a lifelong nerd, I've gone to museums my whole life. Every family vacation, we fondly called the family field trip, because if we weren't learning, it wasn't fun. But I really came into it as an academic practice in my master's program at Southern Illinois University, where the Department of Historical Studies was beginning a museum studies certificate. And so as, I'd always been interested in museums and in the practice of museums, or possibly working in a museum. I jumped at the chance to be able to do that grad work in addition to a master's, because at that point, I just didn't know what my final goal was going to be. And I wanted to have as many options as possible.
We talk a lot about reenacting and living history on the podcast. Where might those things sort of fall into under this umbrella of public history?
Obviously, I think it's squarely in public history. And a lot of this is because, living history sites, whether they're specific museums or museums that employ, say, a living history approach or an exhibit for something specific, as well as sites like, I forget what they call the Plymouth site now. I don't think they call it Plymouth Plantation anymore, or Old Sturbridge Village, or, some of these other sites that really kind of embody and embrace everything about living history. That's been a major feature of public history institutions for a long time, especially in terms of thinking about engaging the public. And reenacting, I think, is kind of adjacent and alongside that. Some people question if reenacting is kind of it's got a toe in public history, but it's more hobbying or it's passion project versus a real curriculum that you learn that to do it. But that's something that public history has to navigate too, especially amongst academic historians. The idea that hands-on or applied history, which is what public history used to be called in the 70s, and is now kind of going back to that because applied history can take on so many meanings, is that it is sort of a different practice and or not as quote-unquote rigorous, maybe, as academic history is. And so I would argue that reenacting kind of operates or has that same character that public history as a general subfield, is that people who are not in the community don't understand all of the things that kind of form the foundation for how people practice, the research that goes into, say, mounting an exhibit, versus understanding who you are reenacting, what you're reenacting, all of the details that go into reenacting. which can obviously be taken to an extreme and become the focus, but oftentimes aren't. They are just the environment that is really necessary in order to do the activity or to do the project.
Speaking of historians and history, is there a prerequisite to be considered like a historian? Does somebody need something like a graduate degree or a PhD in history to sort of label themselves as a historian?
I would say no, but with really strong caveats. No, you don't need a graduate degree to be a historian, but being a historian is not the same thing as being able to rattle off history. As I've said, and I know you've heard me say before, right? Not Jeopardy parlor. It's not just about an encyclopedic knowledge of X event or person or even country. It's about applying a really systematic methodology to the analysis of history, the interpretation of history, and understanding the meaning of all those facts that are so important. And so where people tend to run into problems is when, self-trained historians or people who just have an enthusiasm for history, I don't like to negate them. They need that interest to get going. That's the whole point, right? But they also, need to be willing to understand that it is more than just finding that super fancy document in the archives. It is going through tons and tons and tons of types of sources, and then also having the skills to situate what you find against what's already been written, what we call historiography, sometimes employing theoretical frameworks explicitly or implicitly, and really approaching the study of history as scientifically as possible. And so I would say, again, it's something that can be self-taught, right? I have read really great works of history by people who are not trained historians necessarily, but they are trained in some ways in research skills, in reconstruction, right? And that's really what historians do more than anything, is essentially try to reconstruct as much as possible and as accurately as possible what happened in the past and how that then means something to people. And so that's often what you get taught in graduate school. I think that's a surprise to people sometimes. And it was for me. I was a history major in undergrad. And when I began my history degree in graduate school, I had no idea what I was in. When I started graduate school, I had no idea what really was waiting for me in the next step, in sort of the next level of doing historical analysis and historical study. I kind of figured I always liked history. I find it fascinating. I like a little bit of everything. And I'm pretty good at retaining those bits of trivia. But it was well beyond that at the graduate level. And so, sometimes I say, dip a toe in if you find it interesting. Take a class here and there. But it is not a prerequisite to be even a very, very good historian to have a graduate.
Ooh. And I guess that leads to the question that is there sort of this gap between academia, academic historians, and something like the reenacting and living history community?
Yes, obviously. I think anybody who's been in the reenacting community, and again, I'm only adjacently connected to it as I know people who do reenacting in a variety of ways. But, there is sort of this, I hate to say it, but sort of a sneering kind of condescension sometimes to reenactors and kind of dismissing the entire field as just being obsessed with, is the right smudge on the canteen in the right place? And that sort of attention to detail, as opposed to a gateway into understanding all the contours of an event. Civil War, for example. What really happened in the Civil War? What was the whole point of the Civil War? These questions that get asked a lot. I would argue that reenacting is an opportunity to really critically interrogate some of the things we think we know. Whether it's about what type of gun would have been used, or, the mass production of water canteens, or the lack of standard uniforms, or whatever it is, that can open the door to some really important analyses and interpretations and understandings of them. I know some people who are academics who also participate in reenacting. And so those bridges are really important, partially because it's like people having two views of a similar thing. They have a foot in the reenacting world, and they have a foot in the more entrenched institutional production of history world. And so because of that, I think they see utility in both. But there are a lot of people who kind of blink at reenacting because it can be misunderstood. Or it boils down to who they know who does it. And everybody does reenacting for different reasons, whether it's because of interest in a subject matter, or because of a family connection, or because somebody really, sorry for the phone, really truly believes in what they're reenacting and wants to recreate it for whatever reason. And you actually see a little bit of a similar, sorry, my phone, a little bit of a similar dismissal of public history generally by academic historians. I know I alluded to that, and that public history is an academic subfield, but there is definitely a perception that it is something different. And it is, but it's not. It draws on all of the historiography that came before it. It impacts where research goes. And I think reenacting does that too, to an extent. Some of the questions that get asked in the course of reenacting, provide the next research trajectory, even if people won't recognize that that's where it came.
Well, and it seems as well too that reenacting living history helps, I guess, bring history to sort of the general audience as well, who most likely will not be reading, the most recent academic journal on that subject. And so it could do things like spark the interest in the topic, or even provide some information to them. So I think there's the use in that. We do see a number of museums that were originally considered sort of these highbrow academic institutions, sort of adopting this general history approach in order to, I think, reach a wider audience, but to also make it accessible in a way.
Well, and some of that too comes from the roots of the museum field in general, whether it's a living history site or a living history museum, or your brick and mortar Smithsonian's Museum of Modern Art, whatever the institution is. And the reasons for establishing those institutions comes from, at least in the United States, it comes from the period known as the national period, the museum building period, roughly around the 1880s. And it's after the Civil War, it's before the turn of the century, but really kind of in line with era and the Gilded Age, when you have philanthropists who are, wealthier beyond imagining, who need something to do with that and don't just. But the other reasons for it come from several different motivations. And I'd be interested in your take on this too, from a reenacting perspective, is on one hand, you're talking about a period where a lot of immigration is happening. And so a lot of museums get started as a way to teach how to be an American. And that's an explicit goal. It's connected to the settlement houses and, Jane Addams and all of those progressive projects, very much connected to, here's what your new history is. And you need to understand this and you need to know this so that you can perform the nation the right way. Also, so you can learn English, right? And they tended to be almost alongside Americanization classes that you see in sort of this notion of the greater good, the public good of thing. But you also have the emergence of museums as an outgrowth of wealthy people who could collect a whole lot of things. The curiosity, where, somebody just started to collect all kinds of stuff and wanted a place to show it off. And back in the day, you'd show it off to your friends, and then your friends would show it off to you. But the ability to go into that kind of institution was very limited. It was not considered a public space. It was very much about, accessibility to status and things like that, that would get you an invitation and to even see some of these things. And that steadily changes, again, partially because I think of the environment and the social norms that were happening and the discussions that were happening around things like philanthropy. What's going to happen when I'm dead to all my cool crap? you start to see, well, let me show you these neat things. You should pay an admission to come see it. And charging admission to being a see collections and to be able to touch objects and be able to be in the presence of, great works of art and all of these things. And we can talk about the connections to imperialism and that whole psychology around the possession stuff later. Freud had things to say about and the idea of control when you house and possess things, but maybe not unrelated, but less focal than is this sort of idea that it's an enterprise with a lot of motivation. Complicated ones, interlocking ones, sometimes counterproductive ones, and might kind of line up with, some of those first reenactors or even current ones who, need the leisure time, if we call it leisure time, need the time to be able to go and do it, to amass the materials, to collect things, to do the research, whatever research is considered necessary in order to go forth and be a reenactor. And that takes a particular person, not only in terms of passion and disposition and all of that, but also the ability logistic and to go to those places and to go camp out for 3 days and all.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a time investment and money investment, as any reenactor knows. Putting all kinds of cash into it, but even to do it well, may require taking time to go travel to museum and if you have different, it's much easier, I think, to be an American Revolution reenactor or an American Civil War reenactor in America than to do something like, say, medieval or ancient or, because that requires, one, having access to material culture that you might not be able to as easily as somebody, say, in Europe. But it also means finding vendors to make or sell you something that you need, or learning how to make it, yourself. And so that's another time and money commitment, I think, as well.
For sure. And I think too, we can talk about both things. Reenacting museums as being revolutionized periodically in a variety of ways, whether it's the museum period and establishing some of these, the professionalization of museum practice versus being the purview of volunteers, usually among, the wealthier of the community, oftentimes wealthy women, particularly before they have the vote, those types of things. And then you have, ongoing technology. The internet completely revolutionizes the way that, or the fears about how people consume. And I say the word consume really broadly here, not just going to the gift shop and not just going and paying admission, but how they absorb and consume the institution, and whether or not the internet would displace the museum. Why do we need it if we've got pictures and these types? And I would imagine for somebody who is, essentially building the kit in order to reenact, the internet helped in order to be able to get some of the materials that might be harder, that you might have to figure out how to make yourself, or be engaged in networks that were, I don't want to say much more personal, because I disagree with the whole idea that the internet meant we're not personal, but we're much more tied to, I'm going to join this group and pay dues to this and get the newsletter, and that will have people I can contact, as opposed to I'm going to do the Google and I'm going to search for somebody or go on eBay or go on Amazon or whatever it is. And you see similar discussions, I think, just talking about intended and unintended consequences that might have for the community.
Yeah. And I mean, just the fact that primary and secondary sources are being digitized at an insane rate, that now you might not have to, say, travel to a library to get the interlibrary loan and wait for the book, and right. Just to get that one paragraph of information, which has happened.
But at the same time, it doesn't totally replace that either, because there is something to the experience, and so much of reenacting and the museum world and public history is about the experience that cannot be replicated by reading the book or going to that library in order to get that book for that one footnote. But getting a sense of where am I? How is this community connected? I'm a Germanist by trade. I do my research in Germany. A lot of my materials are now being digitized, but most of them aren't. And can you be taken seriously as a researcher if you never go to the place you're researching? You can make the argument for a reenactor, place is incredibly important, particularly if you're reenacting a battle, or it might seem odd to go, yeah, I'm reenacting Gettysburg in Madison, Wisconsin, and I've never been to Gettysburg, where so much of the narrative of that battle is about the topography and where people were and how they would interact, because you have some of those similar questions.
In bringing up museums as well, and as I mentioned, a number of museums are starting to sort of utilize reenactors. How would a reenactor or living historian be able to sort of adopt or use, I would say, the skills of public history to sort of further their sort of goals?
Well, I think some of it is you already have the foundation as a living historian, or I would argue, even though we may not have used the terminology, that's been an inherent part of engagement with the public for a really long time. When you talk about interpretation and preservation, there is discussion about what form your interpretation takes, right, in the museum world, but also in just historical interpretation. Broadly speaking, is it thematic? Is it more passive where you're telling the story? Or is it where you are essentially taking on characteristics and engaging with a visitor as if you were at that time? And that has been used a lot. Growing up in some of our family field trips, we would tour from the Midwest. I'm from Wisconsin, touring around the Great Lakes. You go to some of these forts that were really important, say the War of 1812, or even earlier as expansion was happening and interactions between the French and Native nations and the Canadians, such as they were. You've got those forts, and they use either, a brief reenactment or some sort of engagement to get the visitors interested, but really part of the story. That's a very well known. I mean, you even see this in education as well, the idea of educational simulation, whether it's something as diverse as recreating, I've seen a couple of these, like recreating the tennis court oath and talking about the French Revolution. In my classes, we actually do a twist on the Paris Peace Conference at the end of World War I, and I have students take on the interests of specific countries, and they hammer out their own Treaty of Versailles, not really like recreating it, not doing it exactly as it was done in history, but using their own version, very short version compared to the original, to open the door to some of these questions. And I guess that's really getting at, the real answer to which is what can reenactors take or living historians take forward to do their goals that build on the practices of public history. And I would say it really is identify what questions you open up. What questions, what debates, what discussions are you having with other living historians about what? What is it about? And there are different layers and different levels of questions, right? All the way from, that's a musket. Where'd you get your musket? Or, that chainmail's pretty cool. How did you do it? Beyond those types of questions to, building on the objects and the material culture. What does that show us about how things have changed from the way that we understand warfare and conflict, that you can reenact a battle because we have sort of an idea, whether or not it's a totally true idea, of a battlefield, and that's where that happens. And then home is over here. And they are separated to, this idea of kind of a melding of the home front and the battlefront and the age of the internet, where warfare isn't necessarily even in person, physically co-present, and bang, shoot you with guns. It's not even that, right? When we talk about cyber warfare. So I think that's kind of the big question, is what are the questions? How do you come to answer that? What is your approach? How can you make those questions less about a particular answer and more about opening up the door to thinking really broadly about what those
I guess now to change it up a little bit to a little bit of current events. There's a lot of, I guess, politics going on over this idea of monuments and statues, and we're racing history. So where do monuments and statues kind of fit into all of this? And do they serve us in terms of history, I guess, or our own history?
Whew, complicated question. And I have several different answers that I hope all will dovetail at the end. I mean, I think that very much like historical facts are not history, monuments themselves are not really historical memory. Because once you craft a monument, you do it in a particular time for a particular reason, and then the meaning can change over time for a variety of people that were never, either A, was never intended, B, totally was intended, and C, is now subject to different frames of reference, right? We don't write history the same way that we did 100 years. We don't even write history the same way we did 20 years ago. And that's not about whatever buzzword we have, wokeism or any, it's not about political correctness. It's not about that. It's about how we understand what came before us and what types of questions we ask. So there's that. I think the biggest question I would have is A, which monuments, because there's a lot of different types of monuments, whether they're statues, whether it's somebody placed something, a building can even be a monument simultaneously. And the context is so incredibly important. How is that monument or statue contextualized? Is it contextualized? Does it require sort of this invisible knowledge that you get simply by being a part of a community? That when you have new people come into your community, and that happens all the time, ebbs and flows, migrations, movements, people move away, people move back, they learn something new, they're not the same people they were a year ago. Nobody is, right? That with the changes in individuals as well as the changes in societies, that it's the contextualization piece that public historians in particular want to talk. Not just that patch of ground over there is really important. Well, why? It just is, right? You can see similar things with arguably even how we deal with death in cemeteries and graveyards and the changing practices, the changing types of stones, right? You see this go through cycles, whether it's the materials that headstones are made with, the type of font. All of a sudden now we can engrave pictures, and people, can enclose objects in the granite or whatever piece they use, or they don't, and they've been cremated and there is no sort of place that they are. And you see similar things with statues and monuments too. So yeah, there's a place for them. I think more often than not, the debates happen because there is a debate over content. There is a debate over meaning. And, one thing that we as human beings don't like to do is change things. Whether it's changing a sign, because that's just the sign that was always there, or if there isn't one, why put one there? Everybody knows changing the name on a street, right? Nothing gets people going more than changing names on a street, when in reality, that is just a geospatial marker most of the time. The meaning is a sign, right? So I would say there is not an erasure of history, because those aren't history. Just like knowing that the Civil War was 1861 to 1865 isn't history. What do you do with that? It's pretty cool that you have that fact, but the meaning's the important part. Understanding, and putting it into a lot of different potential meanings too. One person can assign meaning on a statue as being evidence of a really terrible situation, a horrible period of time, a horrible person, etc. Whereas somebody else will not look at it that way. And whether we're talking about Confederate monuments, whether we're talking about scraps over Reagan laying a wreath in a cemetery in Germany in 1987, where members of the Wehrmacht may very well have been Nazis, and there were all kinds of people who were like, what should we do with that? So, all to tie up, I think this is just a hint. You move it forward, Briesacher, is it really is about the reflective nature of what history is and what public history is, and I would argue what reenacting is, because so many people do it for and that kind of, I think, might help put proper perspective on what statues and monuments are.
So similarly, I guess to monuments, and in recent news, the trailer for the movie The Last Duel with Matt Damon and what's his name, Adam Driver, just dropped, and the reenacting community is abuzz because especially medieval reenactors don't like blue filters over movies and sort of the tropes that come with I guess the genre of historical movies. But where might something like a historical movie fall in? Is it similar to where it gets it out to a general audience, or does a movie actually do service for history?
Also a good question. And again, it really comes down to nuance and what is the purpose, right? If it's about accurately reconstructing absolutely everything, you're going to find most movies disappoint, right? I cannot watch historical movies with my mom. She can't. Sometimes she'll ask me, but a lot of my family members are just like, stop it. No, because I'm sitting there going, that's not right. That's not right. That didn't happen. Not that guy. Those types of things. But you're also talking about a production that is trying to tell a story and sell tickets, right? And so you will have movies where writers and directors and actors are really committed to being as faithful as possible to the historical people that they're portraying, to the events or what have you. But at the same time, it sort of is what is the big takeaway, right? What is the meaning? What is the meaning associated with it? And I think that's probably going to be the tagline to this entire conversation, which is, we can talk about how sometimes movies get things egregiously in pursuit of assigning meaning where it isn't. And so for that, I would say we definitely have to kind of look askance at some of them. But on the other hand, if it can get people interested, and the general takeaways are what we could call right or accurate or authentic, I don't know that it is worth getting worked up about. I'll also say I just looked up that movie and I have no idea what it's about. So I didn't know about it. And this is the thing too, is that, every community has sort of their tightly held things that, you just can't cross that Rubicon. I'm a Nazi scholar. And so any movie about Nazis, I'm going to be kind of staring down, minus Inglourious Bastards but I'm going to be staring that down, kind of going, okay, what are you trying to say? What is the point? Especially, okay, you're going to get stuff wrong. What's the stuff you're going to get wrong? And does it perpetuate a potentially damaging and totally misleading narrative, or what historians do, or how historians understand X person or Y event? If it does, then that's a conversation. If it really doesn't, then it's so why maybe were these choices? Obviously for the enterprise of producing a successful movie and paying your actors ridiculous of money. But at the same time too, we can interrogate those. Those are all sites of opportunity for and I think it depends on who and what communities kind of feel ownership over the thing being portrayed, in what ways, why, and what it means. So again, it comes down to meaning. I don't know if I actually answered your question. I kind of talked around it partially just because, I don't know what about it is, the problem. So
yeah, and that's a whole another discussion, and requires a lot of social media sleuthing. And
I know, and I'm not going to do it while I'm talking. That would be unfair. So but it's always interesting to me when discussions about movies, memes, even, right, images that are historical in some way or claim to portray or produce some sort of historical understanding. I like to sit and interrogate them, because there's a lot that obviously was unintended sometimes in the production of those things. Just getting likes and being able to be snarky sometimes is all the all that the people want. But I think you can always find a site for serious historical interrogation and inquiry in a lot of places.
And I think you nailed it with the messaging. And in some ways, some of the historical movies, I think, are taking sort of past events and people and sort of using them to make a modern commentary or to tell a story that resonates with modern viewers, sort of these universal stories. It's just that they chose a different setting and time and place.
Well, and so often, I mean, the guiding question often is not at all about that historical person or time. It's often an unstated question of how did we get here? No matter what it is that you're interrogating, what is the relevance to my life experience? How did we get here? Whatever the here is. And there are a lot of ways to answer that question. And sometimes it's not even a question. And I would say too, that may be the case for the living history / reenacting community, it's in pursuit of something.
We did get questions from those who listen to the podcast, some people who are on the podcast. So Matt from Maine asked, in this COVID-19 world, what makes a museum? So I guess the question is, has the concept of a museum changed in sort of the pandemic and post-pandemic?
Well, I would say, it's a good question. And I think some of this is the pandemic has required some fast changes and kind of really grappling with intrinsic fears of the museum community that somehow with the onset of the internet and the ability to just get information and to just see pictures of stuff, that people will opt to do that instead of going to places. Now, obviously, you're always going to have some that it's hard to poll and track, has attendance at places dropped off because of the internet. I don't know how you really test that question. But I think what people have found throughout the pandemic, especially because so many places, so many museums had to close. You have the ones who have not survived, and we're still figuring out who those are. We're still figuring out what institutions will not make it through this. I am a member of the Massachusetts History Alliance, which is an organization of organizations made up of museums and institutions, and we're trying to even get a handle on who of our membership has not made it through or might not. But it's also, I think, shown people really do crave the experience, and really doubling down on how do you recreate experience then when you can't be physically there? What do you do in order to get people to want to be physically there when they can be? And does that mean that putting programs online is a potential death knell for your institution? And I think what people have found is it's partially because yanking it away made people realize what it is they go to those places for. Sometimes it's the information, but it's not just, right? You can look at Stonehenge. You can probably even find its audio tour somewhere on the internet, but people will still go. There's something to be said about being in people will still go to the Louvre. People will still go to some of these places to see any number of objects, problematic history or not, And I think it really does, it's an open question. We're not through the pandemic yet, and to say that things are back to normal is a little premature. And so I think it will take a year or two to really get a sense of what has actually changed. I think what it has done is open the door to creativity in incorporating the World Wide Web, digital ways of communicating information and showing collections, and then also the physical objects themselves, and finding really cool ways to do things that were not even a consideration 2 years ago. And so I think that that's an exciting possibility going forward, and one that I look forward to, because public history museums in general are very much well, let's try it and see what happens. And a lot of best practices have been built on trial and error in some ways. And I think we'll find, you may have some museum norms that come out of this in ways that we never anticipated. and I would imagine this is the same for the reenacting, what it means to do reenacting or living history programming. And despite its connection to particular places, what are the opportunities there? I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion and ongoing discussion.
And talking about sort of virtual exhibits or photographs, we did get another question of, is it possible to use something like 3D printing technology and virtual exhibits to get us on the road to sort of decolonizing museums? And I guess first, it's what do we mean by decolonizing them? But are we able to put ourselves on that road?
It's an interesting question. And, first of all, this concept of decolonizing is one that I think, first of all, the term decolonizing is a problematic, partially because it's what do you mean by decolonizing? Do you mean repatriation or do you mean something? And some of this is, again, going back to the roots of museums as institutions in general. Some very complicated, layered, nuanced, and frankly problematic, very imperialist roots of museums. And we can look at any number of museums and say, okay, because totally Egyptian sarcophagi should be in the British Museum. Where did they come from? Same thing with the Louvre, right? How did Napoleon get these things? Well, he took them home and won't give, right? You see a lot of headlines, just recently Benin bronzes are being given back to Benin from the Berlin Museum. And this is a coup. And so where does 3D printing come in that? There's a lot of discussion. There are some really great, serious and well-researched blogs on sort of this museum practice. Museum Next does a lot of it. The National Council on Public History has several blogs that periodically touch on this very issue. And, 3D printing, I think, is going to be something that we experiment with. I don't think we've really seen as much as we will, partially because the technology has been so expensive and it's becoming more accessible. It's becoming easier. But I think where we can find, benefit from 3D printing is accessibility, in being able to show and display these types of reproductions that are less fragile. People can touch, tactily engage with these things, but I think we have to be very careful too. I know there have been some practices where they will make a 3D printed version of it and then repatriate the object. And I think we need to be careful. I think that requires permission. And I don't know how often museums and institutions ask for permission to make a 3D copy before giving back the object that they've been asked. And that comes down to, just having to sit with the problematic roots of why we have, who owns them. Right? This comes down to the question of ownership and how we understand that, whether it's cultural ownership, whether it's physical ownership. And that's going to take some navigating, especially then once you do have these 3D printed objects, what does that do for things like intellectual? So this is a place where I think there's, again, some great potentials, but also we should be a little cautious in terms of respecting the cultures objects come from, gaining permission before you just do it, and using sort of the framework of, well, we're going to be losing the object. It's just a copy. It should be fine. We'll make a copy and then you can have yours back. I think there needs to be more conversation that surround that. But I think it's an interesting question and one that I hope we see a lot more of.
Well, and it makes me wonder too, as well, if, a 3D printed copy is, considered an artifact, or if it's considered, a museum piece, would that create a whole nother set of issues or concerns?
Yeah, well, and I mean, this is getting to the experience. Why do people go to look at a sword because we say it's Napoleon's? Why do people go to look at specific objects? What import or novelty does that object carry, and will that change visitor behavior? Like, if visitors can touch something because it's not this 3,000-year-old object, but it basically is a facsimile of that. I think this will lead to other discussions about things like authenticating objects, the whole idea of a counterfeit mark and what that means and how we attribute meaning to objects. The provenance, right? The being able to trace the chain of ownership for something. Why we think this pen is so important, but that one's not. And I think that might cause some really great, complicated, complex, but really great discussions about why people go and what the experience is. Is it enough to say, I've seen the Mona Lisa, or to say, I've seen a copy of the Mona Lisa? And what are you trying to get? And what are institutions trying to get by having these things in their collection?
Right.
Yeah.
And then we did have one question from somebody who has a master's in history, and they're curious as to how could they pivot into something like museum studies. Is there sort of prerequisite skills or classes that they might need to take if they're interested in getting into the field?
Sure. I would always say, at least, whether or not it's coursework or whether it's, a book or reading, particularly on the idea of best practices and the foundations for what the field of museums tries to do. It's very hard to give sort of a blanket, take these classes, because the museum world and the public history world more broadly is really diverse and complex. And my phone's ringing again. It's really diverse. So you can have, if you're interested in things like conservation and preserving textiles, I would say you probably want to have some coursework that gets at chemistry and gets at preservation methods and gets at even, weaving and what textiles are, right? The science of textile. If you're interested in historic preservation, you may need to take interior design, you may need to take architecture, you may need to take materials science courses and engineering. Sometimes it depends on the scale of what you're trying to do. You may need to take city planning and tax classes in order to be able to talk about zoning and to talk about, just civic statutes that go into how you preserve a building and all of the things that go in versus, interpretation and thinking about how we engage with audience. And so I think it is first figure out what parts of the museum you'd like work in. What sort of skills would be important for those. Grant writing's always. Museums live and die by grants, even the big ones. They typically get more access to grants because they're the big ones, but grant writing will never steer you. Fundraising, as appallingly unfun as it can be, and it's definitely something I don't gravitate toward. I like the idea of curation and pulling together an exhibit and researching the background of objects and telling a story, right, through objects and material culture as opposed to, say, document. But fundraising is incredibly important. Those donor wings don't build themselves. Being able to attract donors of stuff, right? What you opt to save, the registration methods and keeping everything straight and knowing what shelf that knife is on. I can't tell you the number of things that go missing and are in the building, but nobody knows where they are. Or knowing the chain of provenance because they didn't keep track of it in a system, and then the person who knew all the stuff died and all that information went with. So I would say, first and foremost, you have the tools with a master's in history to go find and research what it is you do. And having a sense of historical methodology and historical research methods. Those all are foundational to the way that museums run. But then sort of figure out what path in a museum do you want? And it may be multiple paths. And you can pick up a class here. Digital humanities, you mentioned digitization as a major feature of our lives, right? And I don't think that's going to end. So digital humanities, there are courses about how do you digitize a 3,000-year-old object? How do you digitize a 3,000-year-old piece of paper or whatever they wrote on, right? How do you preserve those things? And so it takes a huge team, and you can usually take any class and mobilize. It's just about figuring out what aspect you really want.
Okay, and before we finish up, was there anything of your own work that you wanted to plug? Or
Yes, I do. I'm currently actually working on a book-length project that is material culture oriented, and it's really tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's the material culture of face masks and what we're wearing and what we wore, whether it's in past tense or, current, how we constructed them, when we constructed them, how our behaviors changed over time, and really looking at the object of the face mask to tell this story and to document it while it's fresh in people's minds before we move on. The face mask's so ubiquitous, but it will be the thing people forget about. And so it'll be interesting, I think. I have a survey out. If people are interested in wanting to take my survey, please, please, please take my survey and share.
And I can drop the link in the bottom.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I would greatly appreciate it. It is not in order to portray mask wearing or not wearing in any particular way. It is literally documenting this moment in our history. And in comparison with previous moments in our history when we've had to wear masks, the 1918 flu, the material culture associated with polio and other things. And, this has a lot of potential inquiry going forward. It's something that is kind of outside my typical area of research. So it's been a lot of fun and I'm very excited about it. So hopefully people are interested in participating.
Thank you for taking time to speak with us today and being on the podcast.
Yeah, it was great despite my internet issues. So thank you for inviting me on too. And anytime you want a return visit.
Awesome. Thank you. That's it for our show today. Thanks to all of our guests and thanks to everyone listening. This is Deconstructing History.